Thank you. It's nice to be here. I'm supposed to talk about the economy, the deficit, and be funny, and that's pretty much impossible, so I'll try to do 2 out of 3 of them. Okay. So I used to do something on the economy like when the recession really, was when we were first diving deep into the recession, and I'd say, how's the economy doing? Economy bad. Keep it pretty simple. I showed that you could plot it in any downward slope that Excel would give you. It would give you the same result. It was bad, bad, bad. I had photographic representations of the economy, so that was, ha ha ha, very funny. But, that was like, it's sort of like, you hit yourself on the thumb with a hammer and people laugh. And, what a klutz, you hit this it's sort of funny in a gallows humor, bad sort of way. And it was this was kind of like, oops, Wall Street, what a klutz. It destroyed the world economy. And, that you could make jokes about that. Now, though, it's sort of become like chronic back pain. And no one makes jokes about chronic back pain because it just kind of sucks. So, I no longer do this presentation. So, what you're going to get is something that is not funny. So, how did we manage to hit our thumb with the hammer? I think the first thing to remember about sort of the situation the economy's in and how we got here is that the problems didn't start with the recession. The thumb's been hurting so bad, past few years that we sort of forgot that there was some pain people were feeling beforehand. So the 2000s weren't so hot. Median income went down actually during the part between the recessions when you're supposed to be having economic growth and good things are supposed to be happening. Income actually went down at the median. Poverty went up. There were millions more people were unemployed. Job growth wasn't very good. The 2000s weren't actually all that great. This is poverty. You can see it was in the 2000s. It went up, when things were going at their best, it kind of got a little better, but then it ended up going back. You ended up with poverty higher than you started. Income, sort of a upside down of the other graph, right? It went down. It kind of struggled back up to a peak, but you'll see that's lower than it started, which is really unprecedented that when you have a period of economic growth and recovery, that incomes end up at the end of it lower than at the beginning of it. This is from 1980 through 2008, and you can see that the periods of economic growth in the 80s and the 90s, this is years, so it bounces all up and down, but you can see the period between those recessions in the 80s and the 90s, the economic growth was much better than the income growth than in the 2000s. So the 2000s, really weren't that hot. This is employment change. It's a little hard to tell. This is 1990 through 2010. You can kind of see that all the monthly bouncing up and down percentage changes in employment, they're just higher in the 90s than they were in the 2000s. You just didn't. And then, of course, all hell broke loose at the end when we fell into a giant recession. And the gray bands show where the recessions are. So 2000's not so hot. So why weren't people marching in the streets and complaining? Well, this helped. We borrowed a lot, right? So we kind of covered it all up by borrowing, and so that can cover a lot of pain for a while. And a lot of this was underpinned by the housing bubble. You had really rapidly escalating housing prices. So it was fun while it lasted. Of course, sort of fun. It was better than it would have been because you had all these things that fundamentally the economy wasn't really generating a lot of income and doing all that great, but we were borrowing a lot, and that kind of made it less visible that there was a problem and not feel so bad. But then, as we know, it kind of all fell apart. No pun intended, but the house of cards collapsed. So we ended up. What happened was, because there was a real collapse, we actually ended up with an economy that. I'll get to that. We ended up with an economy. It didn't just go back to sort of the muddling along, not that great economy of the 2000s. What it ended up with was a real financial collapse. A total. We had real problems in the financial sector. They couldn't do what they're supposed to do because of this collapse. They couldn't They couldn't be the source of investment capital or borrowed money. So we got not only sort of the weakish economy of the 2000s, we got it overlaid with a real financial collapse that created a lot of problems. We also have another legacy of the 2000s that's hanging over us a bit. One problem with the housing boom and the bubble was that we spent a lot of money building housing and kind of bidding up markets, and that money would have been spent in better ways. And what this shows, I had a slide malfunction. I had total investment in the 2000s wasn't all that great. I don't have that chart, but what this chart shows is the share of investment, so where the investment was going. And the green line shows equipment and structure, was like, machinery, computers, software, all that stuff. And the blue line is residential investment. And then the orange line is other structures, think office buildings, malls, that sort of thing. And what you can see is that we had this big burst in residential, and we had a much smaller share going into equipment and software. So we had lots of houses being built because it was very profitable to do it, because there was this big bubble, because you could borrow money easily to buy bigger and bigger houses, and you ended up not making investments, and so we ended up with a lot of aging equipment, and this happened in the public side too, aging infrastructure. So that's another thing we're sort of dealing with, is that we're behind on a lot of those investments. The other thing I should say, this isn't just kind of an old machine problem. It's also a people problem. Because this was where investments were going, to oversimplify it, we ended up with too many construction workers, mortgage brokers, financial analysts, and not enough engineers and nurses, basically, because there was this big demand for a skill set that now, after it's all collapsed, it's the wrong skill set. So you add all this up, you had a lousy economy really in the 2000s. In truth, you had the bursting of the bubble, bringing the financial markets down. You had misallocation of investment. So it left us in quite a pickle, as my grandmother used to say. And we know the consequences. This is since the beginning of the Great Recession, jobs, and the red bars are total private employment, and the whatever that other color is total employment. And I just broke it out because at the end the census does weird things to the numbers. But the point is, this is change in jobs by every month, and these are historic levels of job loss. The worst since the Great Depression. By the time Obama became president, we were losing over 800,000 jobs per month, which I don't know if you can see it, but sort of the lowest bars there are like December 08, January 09, February 09, March. So it was an ugly, and it's been an ugly scene. And as you can see, I'll talk about where we are now in a bit, but as you can see, things are a little better. So one question is, who's to blame for this? Well, if we're talking about the bubble and its bursting, I would just say that it's not this guy. This guy is happy because he's got a home for himself and his family, and if which a lot of people sort of want to blame people who borrowed money that was offered to them to buy homes for themselves and their families on terms that they, in fact, it turned out, couldn't afford. I actually, in terms of the financial market collapse, number one on my list of who I blame are the Bush-era regulators, who basically didn't believe that markets needed regulation and just let the markets run amok. There were mistakes by Clinton-era regulators, too, that had a lasting consequence, which we can discuss if people are interested in. But it was the Bush regulators who just completely let this happen as it was happening before their eyes. Let the bubble grow, let all these fancy, exotic financial instruments that spread the risk that was being created throughout actually the entire world, and made it so that when that bubble collapsed, everything collapsed. And I would say second on the list is the people in the financial sector who were really the driving force in giving these mortgages to people who couldn't afford them, and creating all these opaque financial instruments. And I really, it is kind of stunning to me that virtually no one in the industry cried foul, right? I mean, there was this huge, I mean, we all know there's massive amounts of lending going on that relied and counted on housing prices going up dramatically forever. All these, exotic financial instruments depending on those loans being paid, and the huge financial sector, and there are very few people who said anything about it. And I mean, I don't know. It's still one of the things about this whole experience that shocks me. And they just, when pushed, because there were people who were blowing the whistle on this stuff, they just defended it, and they argued that the what we now know as a bubble was sustainable. And in the end, they were making lots of money, right? So it was working for them. And in the end, from a purely selfish perspective, it ended up working out for them because they still ended up with a lot of money. But again, the thing that actually gets me is like they never like one of them you'd think would have felt bad and apologized, right? I mean, I'm in the think tank industry. If we have thoughts. If I had a thought that destroyed the world economy, I mean, usually my thoughts don't have that much influence. I'd apologize, right? But it didn't seem to bother them. So, which again is something I sort of I find a little surprising. So I don't put the people in the industry at the top of my list of who's at fault, because I think ultimately that's why we have government regulators, is to in fact to stop private markets from going haywire in ways that hurt the economy. But obviously there's culpability because they came up with this scheme. Just as an aside, there's some who put the blame on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I think that's way overstated. I mean, if people have heard that and want to talk about it, I'm happy to do that later. But let's, back to this guy. He went to a real estate agent and a mortgage broker. They told him he could afford a house. If you raised any questions about, there's this reset here in 3 years, that looks like I don't think I could afford that. Basically, he was told, don't worry, you can refinance when housing values will go up and you won't have a problem. And, the question is, are we going to blame him, for believing these people who, after all, were the expert, the real estate agent, the mortgage broker? They are the experts. They are the ones who know the business. And the other thing is they are backed by and were backed the entire financial sector, who's basically implicitly saying to this guy, you can't afford it. It's going to work out. They were, after all, betting that he would be able to pay it and it would work out. So, I mean, to me, comparing the culpability of this guy, he's culpable for kind of having a goofy smile and weird glasses, but comparing the culpability of this guy, who just wanted a house for his family, with this guy who was the chairman and CEO of Moody's, and basically, held themselves out as the finest assessors of risk in the world, who gave AAA ratings to the securities backed by the other guys, by this guy's mortgage. When I balance those two, I'm putting more on this guy. Or you have, the head of Bear Stearns, who again, they were out selling themselves for their great risk management capabilities. And so, I think, to me, there's no contest on who's at fault. And I think all of this talk that you hear about, it was these people who took loans they couldn't afford, they should have realized it's their fault somehow. I think that's kind of nuts. Okay, back to this depressing picture, the job chart again. Looking, so we were at the bottom, we started coming out. A lot of things had to do with that. One is, at the end of 2008, there was the TARP, which began under President Bush, and which essentially saved the financial sector. I think you can make a good argument that we overshot the mark in saving them, being that they're so incredibly profitable right now, while the rest of the economy, up until recently, hasn't been. But something did have to be done. The economy died. This was very controversial. But country needs a financial sector, and it was effectively gone if the government didn't step up and do something. The other thing that was done, which was very important, was at the bottom here when things were at their worst. President Obama came into office and they passed the Recovery Act, the ARRA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and this was a big help. I think almost everyone serious was agreeing at the time that something like that needed to be done. Some big investment by the federal government. This approached $800 billion spread over, it was meant to be spread over 2 years, and it was. There was big disagreement about whether it was enough. There were a lot of people out there who were saying, economists saying, this just isn't big enough. We're in the worst recession since the Great Depression. We need bigger numbers to actually affect things. I think as a matter of arithmetic, people looking at the, how the output gap and how far GDP was down and everything, they weren't crazy to say that. I mean, they're very smart people saying that. But I think that if you look at the mechanics of government and whether the federal government could have gotten out much more of this into the economy, reasonably quickly without it being a total disaster and massive corruption, I think there's a real question about whether this seemed like about the limit, in fact, that you could get out of the federal government and have it spent responsibly. And I actually think it's pretty remarkable that, in fact, you haven't seen the stories that you often see with big government initiatives of misspent money, given how much money was involved here and how fast it went out. So I think it was certainly a big success that way. And the other thing I think bigger would have been, there just weren't the votes in Congress for bigger. So, but where there was a lot of dispute, aside from the size, but also was how the money should be spent. And I think what you ended up with was something where there were people who thought it should be all tax cuts. People who thought it should all be direct job creation, just hiring people. People thought it should all be different kinds of infrastructure investments, clean energy investments, a real focus on the future. And it was split amongst those. So everybody got something, and everybody ended up with something to complain about as well. But I think it was given it's a political process, it's not surprising that it was divided among the different mechanisms for pumping a bunch of money into the economy. But again, that had a lot to do with the fact that we ended up going from huge, massive job losses to, as the money started entering the economy, fewer and fewer job losses to now what we have, which is relatively modest job gains. And it's non-trivial that the economy didn't end up in another Great Depression. At that point, that was a real risk, that you get into these downward spirals where companies aren't investing, they aren't hiring people, which means those people aren't spending money, which means the more businesses aren't hiring, and you just get into a downward spiral. And we were in a downward spiral that needed to be arrested. And I think if there's a disappointment, it's that. So I think it was really important to block that. If there's a disappointment, it's that what we were hoping was we'd end up with an upward spiral that would sort of be taking care of itself, and that the numbers at the right end of this, the job gains, would be much more substantial than they have been. So there are some real risks associated with having this, modest job gain not really taking off. There's a lot of evidence that when recessions really persist, the economy is permanently damaged in some ways. When people are out of work for extended periods of time, their skills get behind, their grasp of technology. They sort of lose skills, and they don't gain new skills that are needed as technology and the economy is developing. Sort of the capital, the investment base, the capital base becomes outdated. So there are real risks of this. And we're just not creating jobs fast enough. What this chart shows is the blue line at the left is what happens. So the units are actually millions here, but this is jobs in the economy, and they dropped off, right? and the top thin line is how many jobs you'd have to have unemployment be at 5%, which is what it was, and we're at 9 now. So to get an unemployment of 5% by November of 2012 would require 628,000 jobs a month, which would be huge. Just to give you a feeling, we're getting like 30, 40, 50, break 100 every once in a while, and that would be remarkable. If we got the level of job growth that we had in the Clinton era, which was very strong job growth, it would take us all the way to January of 2018 to get up to a 5% unemployment rate. If we had the job growth of the Bush era, that's the green line down here. We're closing it a little bit, but it's going to be a long. I mean, this thing ends in 2025, so it's going to be a long time before we get anywhere near a 5% unemployment rate, and at the current pace, pretty much forever. So, obviously, we need things to take off. Just kind of one other point on about what's going on and why this is so grim. This is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to go all through this, but this is various things that components of GDP basically, and how they fared since the beginning of the Great Recession. So personal consumption, which is very important because that's demand in the stores, right? That's and that's what leads to companies to hire people and invest. That has kind of come back up to where it was. We need it to be growing stronger, but it's back. Equipment and software, that category of investment, it's come back some. Again, it needs to be stronger. But what's killing us is the investment in structures that and residentials and non-residential buildings. And the thing is, that's probably not going to come back so really fast because we overbuilt it. And so what has to happen is we actually have to get the investment side. We have to get it from somewhere else. Just making sure I didn't miss anything. The other thing, and I'll show you one. The next chart's complicated too, but oops, what's happening? There we go. So this is it's investment as a share of GDP on the horizontal axis, and it's economic growth. And so what this chart shows is the countries since during the recession that invested the most grew the most. So you can see China way up there in the right-hand corner invested the most, came up with the most investment, most of it public investment, government investment, and saw the most growth. See the U.S. way down here on this corner at the other end of the line. The line just is the kind of the path that these points plot, and you can see there's definitely a pattern. So it just shows the importance of investment in coming out of a recession, and in particular, what you'll note is that a lot of the countries that have made a lot of investment, it's been on the public side. So where are we? I was recently in January at the ASSA meetings in Denver, American Economics Association meeting. Lots of economists talking about all this stuff, and they don't have any answers. I mean, the truth is, there's a lot of opinions. It's like there's one body of thought, which is the people who do all this modeling of the economy, and they don't understand why we don't have jobs back, because their models told them that with what was going on with the economy, we shouldn't have had nearly the job loss we had. Their models tell them that the businesses completely overreacted, cut jobs way more than they should have, and so you'd expect it to be a huge rebound. So they just don't understand why jobs aren't coming back, and they sort of remain optimistic, and maybe they're right, thinking that we're poised to have a huge amount of job growth. And there have been some positive signs. Some of the exchange rate movement should help. Manufacturing has actually been coming back. Exports have been doing well. So there's some evidence that maybe we'll suddenly cross the threshold and start seeing a ton of jobs. But I think what would clearly help a lot would be another boost to public investment, which would draw in private sector investment. I think the Recovery Act did do a lot in that respect, but all the businesses that kind of were saved probably by the Recovery Act are still being very cautious, and another nudge from government would really help. But nudges cost, and that brings me to, I'm just going to finish up and say a few things about the next cheery topic, the federal budget deficit. Here's the story with this chart. Basically, this is 1980 through 2019. Hasn't happened yet, I know, but that's what projections are. So what you see is federal budget deficit goes up. Reagan cuts taxes and increases defense spending. Clinton comes in, raises taxes, cuts defense spending. Bush comes in, cuts taxes, and raises defense spending. Now, there's obviously other things going on here, but that is a big a big part of the story. Then the recession hits, and almost all of the vast majority of that huge spike in deficits in the last couple of years is actually not the Recovery Act spending. It's mainly the tax revenues just went down the tubes because when people don't have jobs, they're not paying taxes, and when corporations aren't profitable, they're not paying taxes. So you just had a huge drop in tax revenue is the driving force in that. I mean, the Recovery Act, don't get me wrong, was a big increase, but most of that was because of just not because of tax cuts, but just because of the revenue, the revenue drops. And actually, the short-term deficit isn't really a problem. That's what we should be doing in a recession. That's what we need to do to give the economy a boost. But there is a real concern about the long-term deficit. Those levels, 4, 5, 6% of GDP, are levels that most people, even people who've traditionally not been deficit hawks, haven't been really worried about the deficit. Those are levels that people just don't think are sustainable or good for the economy and that do cause problems. So I think the main thing I want to say about this that I think is important is that our long-term deficit problems are a political problem. They're not an economic problem. We're not Greece, Ireland, Portugal. We're the richest country in the world. We could definitely afford to pay our bills if we chose to. And I'm not saying this is the way we're going to do it, as I'll get to this in a second. But we could even do it like all through taxes without driving the country into ruin. This is a chart. This is all the economically developed countries' taxes as a share of GDP. You'll notice the red line. I mean, we are this is counting state, local, federal, all levels of government. And we got Mexico, Turkey, and Korea are the only countries that have lower levels of taxation than we do. And Canada, you'll see, is like below the median. I don't know if that's this column. And the reason I point that out is just that if we in 2013, not saying this isn't a proposal, just to be clear, but if we in 2013 just adopted Canada's level of taxation, which would still be below the developed countries, this is what that deficit chart would go out. Here's the zero line, so below it means we're running surpluses. We'd be running surpluses starting in 2013 and as far out as through 2020. So it's not like, so my point here isn't that this is the policy we should pursue. My point is simply that this isn't like other countries which just don't have the money to pay off how much they've borrowed, pay off their debts and support the level of government they're accustomed to. We're in a position where we could, if we chose to, even without cutting any spending. I just wanted to end on the deficit with this. That it is hard. I think a lot of people, there are people who say we should do it all through taxes, and there are people who think we should do it all through spending cuts. And I think those people aren't really paying attention to what the reality of the federal budget is. I won't go into why I have 2014. It doesn't matter that much. It's a period where we're supposed to be out of the recession, kind of a normal year, and based on the projections, to balance the budget by spending cuts alone, you'd have to cut everything in the federal budget by 18%, which is a huge cut. But it's even worse than that because there are things you wouldn't cut, right? You would not stop paying interest on the federal debt, for example. And obviously, if you take things off the table, the 18% gets bigger. You have to cut everything else by more. So if you took interest payments on the debt out of the picture, then you got to cut everything else by 21%. Social Security, there's an argument for long-term changing the trajectory of Social Security, reducing benefits, raising the taxes that pay for it. But the reality is you're not going to do that really quickly, right? Because people are relying on it. They haven't, if you think people should save more and rely less on Social Security, not what I think, but if you think that, you still wouldn't, nobody has a plan that would really drastically cut Social Security in the short term. If you take Social Security off the table, you got to cut everything else by 27%. I won't go through all these. You can see the slide. But as you start taking things that various people pull off the table for cutting, you end up seeing that it's really practically impossible. It's just there's no feasible path where you're going to do it all through the spending side. And if you think you're going to do it all by taxing rich people, you'd have to tax everybody making over $250,000 a year, the president's line, by 70% more, and that's not going to happen either. So my point isn't that this is impossible. It actually is possible, but people are going to have to stop drawing these rock hard lines in the sand. We're not going to ever raise taxes to do this because that just isn't real. And I think now that the Republicans, frankly, have the House of Representatives under their control and are starting to actually have to put numbers down on paper, I think that's kind of becoming evident. I think there's a lot of evidence of that. I've written about that, but I won't dwell on that. So, wasn't very funny. I know. Sorry. It's not a very funny topic these days. I mean, I would say this just to close that we have a resilient economy, and I think eventually it's going to come back stronger than it is now. We're going to start seeing some solid months of job growth where we're seeing 100, 200,000 jobs a month. I think the question is whether we're going to see 300,000, 400,000 jobs a month, which would really be the sign that we're really going strong, and that you'd really start materially feeling the difference. I mean, when you hear those job numbers, one thing to keep in mind is that you need somewhere between 100 and 150,000 jobs a month just to absorb the growing workforce. So you really need something in the 3, 4, 5, or better range. And on deficits, my view is that there's people who are all panicked that we're never going to deal with the deficits. The numbers are going to force us to deal with the deficits. I think we will. I think we can deal with it in smart ways and dumb ways, but I think that there are forces at work that are going to make us deal with it. So, if people start raising Greece or these examples of other countries, we're just in an entirely different situation than them. So I'm not saying it's nothing to worry about, but it's not anything to panic about. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about the national recession, how it played out in Iowa, and what that does to the Iowa budget, and what's going on in Des Moines these days, and what it looks like in terms of Iowa's response to the budget problems brought about by the recession. And as you can see, I think the theme here is on the part of many of those in Des Moines is to never let a good crisis go to waste, and I'm going to argue that it's Iowa, largely a fake crisis. So let's start with talking about the Great Recession and what it looks like in Iowa versus the rest of the country. We have historically had lower unemployment rates in Iowa and in the U.S., and this period is no exception. This is the unemployment rate from the beginning of the recession in December 2007 to December of last year. The U.S. stuck between 9.5% and 10% for most of the last year and a half or so. Iowa never quite got to 7%. Down about 6.3, I think, is the latest figure. Nonetheless, this is a pretty drawn-out recession here, as it is in the country as a whole. This is a little interesting, and a lot of it looks the same as the national picture, with the exception of the 1981 recession. This is the last 4 recessions. What we're looking at is the unemployment rate from the beginning of the recession, right here, up through 36 months later. If you start with the bottom line, that purple thing, that's the 1990 recession. Unemployment never hit 5%. 2001, quite a bit worse. 2007, much worse than either of those recessions. But even that was less of an impact than the 1980s, which were just devastating for Iowa. And it took us a long time to get out of that recession in the early 80s, much longer than the country as a whole. So just looking at the current recession, what's happened to employment? This is thousands of jobs, so about 1.6.55, actually it's about 1.252 million jobs at the beginning of the recession. The job losses didn't really kick in Iowa until late 2008 and 2009. We hit the bottom in December of 2009. As you can see, we've started to creep up a little bit. So we've had net job gains in the last year. We're down about 50,000 jobs from where we were started the recession 3 years ago. We're getting about, well, this last year we got about 20,000 of those back, 22,000. So at that rate, Iowa will be back to where we were at the beginning of the recession in just another 2.5 years, even at the current rate. And compare that to Mike's slide about the current rate of job creation nationally taking basically forever. We continue on this pace, we'll be back where we were in 2.5 years. We'll be back where we were, which is a nice little economy growing really slowly. It's not like there's ever been in this century a booming economy. We like things moderate, kind of chugging along. Maybe we don't like them, but that's the way we've been and the way we've been stuck. So things weren't so bad, and we might be back to chugging along quite a bit sooner than much of the rest of it. Way too many numbers, so I'm just going to talk about a few of them, but this is where the jobs were lost, where they've been coming back. First column is the beginning of the recession, thousands of jobs, December 2007. The low point in terms of where Iowa jobs hit bottom, a loss of 65,000 jobs, and then the latest number, December 2010. So a 2-year period of job losses, so far 1 year of gains. They're in order of the sectors that were hurt the most in terms of number of jobs. So in that 2-year period, we lost 30,000 manufacturing jobs. And that's a problem because these are by and large good-paying, middle-class jobs, benefits. Still have things like health insurance, pensions. And that sector has actually gained back almost 6,000 of the 30,000 we've lost in the last year, which is good, but still down 24,000 good jobs. Construction, we lost 11,000 jobs, and we're still have gained very few of those back. Next sector, we continue to lose. Leisure and hospitality, that's retail trade, and leisure and hospitality, two sectors with below average wages by and large. Anyway, 65,000 jobs lost in the 2 years, 15,000 we got back. Not quite a quarter of the jobs in the last year. And what's happened to wages? This is a much longer picture of wages, which I think is important. You can see what the 80s did to Iowa. This starts in 1979. The median wage is half workers in Iowa earn more than that, half earn less. 10th percentile, the wage at which 90% of the workforce earns more than that, 10% less. In both of those parts of the economy, both of those wage levels, we kept going down right up into the early 90s. And it took that very long boom period of the late 90s to get us just back to where we were in 1979. And then since then, stagnated. These are real wages. They're corrected for inflation. So it's the purchasing power of the wages of the median worker. In the 2000s, in the last decade, are a little above where they were in 1979, but not much. Those at the 90th percentile of wage earners that have experienced some gains and continue to do so, doing a little better. And of course, the really rich are the ones who are not earning wages at all, but are making money by collecting dividend checks and selling stock. They aren't on this graph. These are just wage earners. If we had them on here, we'd see that they are doing quite well, as they are in the country as a whole. So what does this mean for the public sector in Iowa, for tax revenues and things like that? And what is state government likely to do this year in response to that situation? So obviously, if people are out of work, they don't have money to spend, the housing values are down, they don't feel like they can afford to spend as much as they did before. We don't collect sales tax revenues like we did before. We don't collect income tax revenues like we did before. This shows the last two recessions, what happens to tax revenues in the state. The red line is in current dollars, meaning we didn't correct for inflation. The blue line shows the same revenue figures in today's dollars, 2010 dollars. So you can see the dip that revenues took in real terms actually starting in the late 90s because of some very large income tax cuts that we enacted. And then a sharp dip again, 2009, 2010, but the beginning of a rebound. Could be bleaker. This is a closer view of just the last 3 years and the next fiscal year that we're arguing about now. Fiscal year ends June 30th, so the 2011 fiscal year is the one we are in right now. 2012 is the projection for what's going to happen next year. This is not corrected for inflation, but you can see what the recession did to revenues last fiscal year and this. Next year, a significant increase, but not quite a recovery. Start completely bleak. All right, so if you have budget problems, who's going to feel that? Well, most people don't realize how much of state budget is education, 55%. The region's community colleges, 13%. K-12 education, the state provides roughly half of the funding for elementary and secondary education in the state. So education, all told, is 55% of the state budget. Health and Human Services, a big chunk of that is state's responsibility. For Medicaid, another 22% almost. Justice, that's state troopers and prison guards, and the court system. Those are the big four areas of spending in the state budget. So if you're going to talk about spending cuts, you're talking about cuts in education. You can't do much with the state budget without cutting education. All right, so these are four precepts that we have been hearing if we've been paying attention to the budget debates that we've been hearing since the campaigns of last fall and right up until today in the debates in the Iowa House of Representatives. Four propositions. We have a deep fiscal crisis and cuts to the budget are unavoidable. Government spending has been growing out of control. Taxes have been rising and they're too high, and our business taxes are uncompetitive. This sets the stage for budget cuts. These are the budget cuts that are on the table as part of the governor's budget. If we look at the House of Representatives and what they passed, there are substantially more cuts. But this is the governor's budget. Actually, $35 million for preschool is the cut the governor contemplates. The $80 million roughly is what the House bill contained, because they just voted to abolish preschool, public preschool education. Area education agencies, $20 million. These are the agencies that we set up to make local school systems more efficient by providing essentially some of the things that they can't do economically themselves. K-12 education, we don't have a figure because what they propose is zero growth, which sounds pretty not very drastic, but what that means is that all of the increased costs for health insurance for your employees and energy to heat your classrooms are not funded. You've got to find it by cutting areas, other areas of your budget, and that means teachers' salaries. So zero allowable growth, I'm not going to go into what that means, but what it leads to are layoffs, more layoffs of public school teachers. $35 million for the Regents institutions, $42 for Medicaid, another $100 million out of other state agencies where we're going to have to, which would lead to substantially more layoffs of state employees on top of the reduction of the last years. So if you look at that list, it's education is taking a big part of the hit in this budget. That's because it's a big part of the budget. So, two questions. Are the arguments that set up this budget-cutting scenario, are they valid? Those four precepts that we looked at earlier. And is this fiscal crisis in particular a real one? Well, I'm not going to explain all these numbers except the bottom one in each graph. This is the shortfall that we're really looking at in the budget, $263 million. The bottom, to balance the budget without these drastic cuts. And this is how you come up with a little bit more than that. Bottom line is we are not facing a fiscal crisis. In fact, our local representative said he's been in the legislature for, I think, 13 years, and they've never had more money than they're looking at right now. We always start the year with what looks like a budget problem. Find a way to fix it. The spending going out of control. Well, how do you measure the size of spending? Arguably, one reasonable way is to look at spending on government as a share of the state economy. Mike looked at the deficit that way, as the deficit is a share of GDP. This is Iowa state spending as a percent of personal income, which is one of the measures of the size of, or the extent of economic activity in the state. It's all of the income earned by individuals, wages and salaries, proprietors' income, profits of small businesses, etc. And what you see is that state government has taken a declining fraction of that income to pay for public services at the state level. Over 6% throughout the 90s. Recently, it got up as high as 5.5%. Now we're, last fiscal year, back down to under 5%. It's hard to make a case for the growth, for government spending being out of control. Are taxes high in Iowa? No, they're below average, have been for quite some time. In the early 90s, we actually took a little bit more in taxes out of personal income than the national average. Now we take less, and we are 26th among the 50 states. Hard to make a case that we are a high-tax state. This is all state and local as a share of personal income again, the same denominator as last time. Are business taxes uncompetitive in Iowa? We now rank 40th in our corporate income tax collections as a share of the private economy, private sector GDP, well below the national average. If you look at overall business taxes in Iowa, we're about 36. You can't make a case that Iowa business taxes are not competitive. Now, one area of spending that has arguably gotten out of control recently is tax credits for businesses. This shows two things: general fund revenue and tax credits for businesses indexed to 100, so we can see how they've grown over the years. So in 2006, the level of tax credits given a value of 100, general fund revenue given a value of 100. What does it look like now? Projections for 2012, a little bit above where we were in 2006. Tax credits about 160% of where they were in 2006. And recently we got to see where some of those tax credit dollars are going. This is one of the credits, one of the bigger ones, but just one of the ones we're giving. The top 6 recipients are shown there. Rockwell Collins, $14 million. Deere and Company, almost $13 million, et cetera, et cetera. Big corporations, very profitable companies. And these 6 are among 133 that paid no corporate income tax. So these are companies that need an educated workforce. In fact, from time to time, explain how important state funding of education is, but they contribute nothing at the state level, paying for that, and in fact, we write them checks to pay for their research. This is a refundable credit, meaning that it first reduces your taxes to nothing, and then if we still owe you a credit, well, we'll just write you a check. It's not a refund of taxes you paid, just a grant. All right, so if we don't have a fiscal crisis, or if we do have a fiscal crisis and we can't afford to keep funding preschool and other things, why are we contemplating tax cuts? Now, we're not going to pass all of these, but all of these are tax cuts that are either in the governor's budget or are the subject of legislation in the Iowa House. The 20% across-the-board tax, cut in income tax, $700 million a year. We have a $6.2 billion budget, so these are huge holes in the budget. Cut the corporate income tax rate in half, $200 million. Remember, we're 40th on the corporate income tax. They want to cut the rate in half. Of course, that won't be any benefit to Rockwell Collins because they're already paying zero, and I think you know that 0 is 0, but it'll help a bunch of others. Cut commercial property taxes by 40%. That's $600 million a year. So that either comes out of the height of local governments or state finances, and it comes out of the state budget. We don't know which. Commercial property is a third of the local tax base. So where are schools and counties going to get their revenue if you take a third of the tax base and whack 40% of it away? $1.5 billion in tax cuts on the table out of a $6.2 billion budget, almost 25% of the budget. Tax cutting mania. Well, what What ought we to be doing, and what are we likely to get? This is a quote from a friend of mine. What you need, what you want, what you get are three different things. What we need, well, first of all, we need a resurgent national economy. It would be nice if there were just some recognition in Des Moines that we don't have a whole lot to do with what happens to our economy in the short run. If the country and the world gets out of a recession, that's going to be the biggest thing to help Iowa. We're not going to have much to do with that. We're a low-wage state. We ought to be thinking about measures to raise wages. There are a lot of things we could do to support people who want to work, who need to work. If you look at the long-term pattern of growth among states, the biggest determinant of rising incomes is rising education levels. We are shooting ourselves in the foot in the long run if we disinvest in our education system. And there are some specific investments that we could make. We should be making investments in infrastructure. It may make sense to spur development in certain sectors where we have some advantages, where the technology is developing and where the industry could grow, provide jobs, and eventually stand on its own without public support. What do Iowans want? Well, some of this comes from polling. They'd like to raise taxes on rich people and corporations. A substantial majority thinks they're getting away paying too little. There's a lot of support for health care and education, even if it means raising taxes. We just passed a bond bill, or at least we passed a bill earmarking sales tax revenues for natural resources and recreation by a wide margin. What we're likely to get? Tax cuts, mostly for rich people and corporations. That's what seems to be on the agenda. Higher property taxes for everyone else. Well, that's because those commercial property tax cuts are probably going to raise everybody's property taxes to pay for it. The state is not going to fully fund that in the long run if their past behavior is any indication of what they do when they give away a local property tax base. They replace it for a while and then they stop. And the school funding is going to partly result in property tax, the lack of school funding by the state. We're looking at cuts in education at all levels, from preschool to Regents institutions. We're looking not at job creation in the short run, but at job destruction as we lay off public workers. 50 local area education agency workers have already gotten their pink slips in the anticipation of the $10 or $20 million in budget cuts that have been proposed in Des Moines. We're going to have less public safety, not more. We're going to be laying off state troopers and firefighters. Hard to have fewer enforcers of workplace safety, but I think we will manage. We hardly have any now. We have one employee part-time monitoring wages and hours violations, which is an area where we rank 50th among the 50 states. What we're likely to get in the long run from some of these measures, if they continue, I haven't talked about some of the other legislation, but there are a number of initiatives aimed at weakening unions. We are shrinking the middle class when we attack the paying benefits of middle class jobs in the public sector, and that is partly to reduce the competition to allow the private sector to pay lower wages as well, and we are on the path towards a second-rate education system if we continue to defund the way we have been. Won't all this tax cutting spur economic growth? No, it won't. And this is an area that I've spent a lot of time researching, so I can tell you why it won't. if you look at business taxes, they're a tiny share of the total cost of doing business. State and local taxes. Federal taxes are substantial. State and local taxes are about 2% of the overall cost of doing business. Corporate income taxes are only a small share of that. If you cut the corporate income tax in half, as they're proposing, on average, you've cut total cost of doing business in Iowa by about 0.1%. And I don't know anybody who thinks that that's enough to sway many corporations to build a plant here that they wouldn't have otherwise. You just don't have much leverage over business decisions with the tax code. Everything else is much more important. Wages, energy costs. Google came here. What did they want? They wanted cheap energy. So tax policy can be shown, and there's been a variety of studies showing this. I mean, many dozens of studies over the last 25 years. You don't go to a corporation and ask, did this tax break we gave you help make you decide to locate in Iowa? They're going to say, sure. Go to the State Economic Development Department, and they'll say, sure. How do they know? Well, because that's what John Deere told me. It made a difference. You have to do a study, and you have to look at whether, if taxes do make a difference, and we look at states that have lower taxes on business, states that have higher taxes, controlling for everything else that matters, that the taxes make a difference. What you find out is that they really don't, not very much at all. Other things matter, including education, including infrastructure. So cutting business taxes and cutting education is not a path towards economic growth. Well, I decided I had to end on upbeat notes, so there it is. Okay.